Early civil rights movement. Civil rights are rights that are bestowed by nations on those within their territorial boundaries. Examples of civil rights and liberties include the right to get redress if injured by another, the right to privacy, the right to peaceful protest, the right to a fair investigation and trial if suspected of a crime, the right to vote, the right to personal freedom, the right to freedom of movement, and equal protection. When these rights on paper were later found inadequate, the civil rights movement emerged as the vehicle for claiming more equal protection for all citizens, advocating laws to restrict the effect of current discrimination. Following the Civil War, it was obvious that African Americans may be quote unquote free, but they were definitely not equal in the United States. While racism and inequality was embedded in society throughout the country, it was much more rigid in the South. Whites, especially Southern whites, continued to see blacks as inferior. Jim Crow laws not only enforced the separation of whites and blacks, but also stripped blacks from many of their basic civil rights. Housing covenants determined where blacks could or could not live. Schools were segregated, and there were limited opportunities that kept blacks as domestic servants and laborers throughout the South. Poll taxes and literacy kept blacks from full political participation. Jim Crow segregation in the South was not only just an institution of written laws, but an institution of unwritten laws. And Southern whites protected this institution through sheer violence. Most found themselves denied of every possible avenue to either establish their own socio-economic independence or participate fully in the larger society. The civil rights movement will naturally emerge from the Jim Crow South because of its blatant racism and violence towards blacks. Early court cases of the civil rights movement. By 1954, there was the Brown versus Board of Education that argued that separate is not equal and forced the integration of public schools. They used the justice system and the Constitution to push for equality. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery boycott, 1955. While Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus or give up her seat for a white passenger, this sparked the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, where some 40,000 African Americans refused to ride the buses for one full year. This was a tremendous organizing effort from several black communities that put economic pressures on the transportation services, forcing them to desegregate their buses. Martin Luther King will emerge from the Montgomery bus boycott and is recognized by most as the civil rights leader. He was a preacher and studied Gandhi's theory and practice of nonviolence. Under the spiritual guidance and the nonviolent philosophy of Dr. Martin Luther King, tens of thousands protested and marched for freedom and justice for America's black minority. Religion and civil disobedience was at the core of this nonviolent movement. Civil disobedience is the active refusal to obey certain laws, demands, and commands of a government or of an occupying power without resorting to physical violence. It is one of the primary tactics of nonviolent resistance. This took the form of sit-ins, marches, and boycotts throughout the country. State repression. While the early civil rights movement's approach was nonviolent, it was definitely not a peaceful struggle, meaning that the reaction by the dominant white majority who resisted change was extremely violent. Along with white vigilante groups, most notably the KKK or Ku Klux Klan, local police, state troopers, and even the FBI was utilized to crack down on the civil rights movement. Frequent imprisonments, the bombing of residencies and churches was also frequent. Lynchings, beatings, and disappearances were carried out. Even illegal wiretappings and the planting of snitches within the movement were later uncovered as FBI files were released to the public. These were attempts to intimidate and wear down the movement. Thus, being engaged in the civil rights movement meant the likelihood of arrest and jail time at the least, but it also a strong likelihood that your life and your family's life was constantly in danger. Early civil rights achievements. By the second half of the 1960s, the sacrifices made by civil rights activists began to materialize in legislative achievements. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination in employment practices and public accommodations. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 restored and protected voting rights. Immigration and Nationality Services Act of 1965 dramatically opened entry to the U.S. to immigrants other than traditional European groups. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 banned discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. Executive Order 11246 enforced affirmative action for the first time. This was issued by President Johnson. The executive order required government contractors to take action toward prospective minority employees in all aspects of hiring and employment.